This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Today, we end up with a spicy debate between myself and the lobbyist for the League of Cities. We're talking about whether or not housing ought to be deregulated, or maybe more importantly, should we try to make the permitting process and the regulatory process more palatable and less costly, especially to new time home buyers? Now, in this discussion, we had Elliot Pollack in the beginning, but you'll see that he was in his car and his phone ended up kicking out. For those of you who love Elliot, and he definitely has some supporters on this channel, he's only in here for a little bit of time. I tried to carry the debate on my own side, doing the best that I possibly could. But again, what you'll see is that there's some real divisions. Now, in saying that, I have a lot of respect for the cities. I was mayor, and there isn't much here that I have a criticism of that I suspect couldn't have been a criticism of me during the time that I was there as well. But I really am concerned about the excessive regulations and the negative effect that that's having not only on construction and building, but most importantly on trying to make homes more affordable. And I give a pretty detailed explanation of what that looks like. Now, I'm just an ordinary optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. I wrote a book about that called What's Right with America, where we talk about how it is that we can find our way to make certain we tackle the big issues that exist. If you like what it is that we're talking about here on New Frontiers, push that subscribe button. Let's go ahead and get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, I'd like to welcome both of my guests here today. First, I want to welcome back Elliot Pollack. I like calling him the Oracle. He's over my life constantly been predicting things. Sometimes I didn't listen to him, but it always tended to work out his way anyway. But Elliot, thanks for being back on the show today. What's that background you got going on there? Is that like a fake background or the real
It's
thing?
a real fake background. A lot of people want to have a car in their background, so I decided I'd sit in my car.
That's looks like you have an escape
I
hatch
do,
or something
because
over the top of it, but that's probably
Yeah,
important for an
there's something I have
economist.
to be at, and I'd rather spend the time in the car and not have to drive here, so we could spend more time with this, which I think is important.
All right, and then Nick Ponder is a lobbyist. He works for the League of Cities. He also works for a group called High Ground, I have some friends over at High Ground. High Ground, I always love their name because that's the whole basis of their lobbying group is they try to start by approaching things from the high ground, from the right side of things. We have some disagreements, I think, on the housing issue today. We'll figure that out as we go through it. But nonetheless, Nick, if you would, just talk a little bit about the role that you've played in this whole housing debate without going into what others are asking for, just to help give context to the role you'll be playing today.
Yeah, thank you, Paul and Elliot. Nick Ponder, I'm the VP of Government Affairs, Senior VP of Government Affairs for High Ground Public Affairs. I've been over here since December of 21, and as you mentioned, I represent many entities at the state capitol, one of which is the League of Arizona Cities and Towns, but I also represent many other municipalities at the state capitol individually. So while the League is one client, I also have several municipalities who are also clients individually. And my role at the state capitol for the last 3 legislative sessions, at least on this particular item, so 23, 24, and 25, has been one of the principal negotiators representing municipal interests at the Capitol on legislation related to housing. So I watched and listened to the podcast that you all did in March, and while I found it interesting, I also found that from my perspective, I think it was a little one-sided, and so I wanted to see if there was an opportunity to maybe provide that other side and have, as you and I talked earlier, Paul, maybe a spirited debate to that other side.
Yeah, I was actually excited when we got the letter. All right, so the first thing is that when we got this letter from Nick, and again, as I said, I've known High Ground and Nick for some time. I've also known certainly the League because I was mayor of Phoenix and I worked a lot with him. But the letter was a pretty extensive letter. I just pulled out a couple of comments here. The first one was I paid close attention and felt that there was a lot of omissions in the analysis, misstatements of active legislation, and glossing over the NBER study that would like to address some of these points. I thought when he was talking about the misstatements, he was actually talking about Henry, but on the next comment, Henry, who's our professor, he said the truest statement made in the entire 90 minutes was from Thompson, which was that the entire housing shortage was market driven and that the correction of the housing issue would be corrected by the market. Now, I'm not sure why you picked out Henry to give the one compliment you gave in the entire darn letter, but Henry is a professor at ASU and he comes from New Zealand. I thought this had something to do with the sanctuary city thing that's been going on at local governments. But nonetheless, Nick, if you would, tell me, if you would, about why you wrote the letter and what was the intent? What were you trying to convey to us?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think I highlighted it in the beginning, which is that I just felt like there could be another side presented to this conversation. So, I think that there's been a lot of conversation. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of this conversation that's been going on at the Capitol. So I want to be very clear that everything that you're going to hear from me is coming from the lens of the conversations that I hear at the state capitol. And those conversations seem to try and portray this issue as an issue that originated, that the housing crisis seemed to originate as an issue driven by zoning decisions at the local level. And I haven't found a single economist that will tell you that that is how this all originated. Yes, there have been studies that have articulated how certain decisions could be made to provide benefit to the policy decisions. But I think every study that I've read about how the housing crisis originated goes through the analysis of, and I believe Elliot's even talked about this, the analysis of how we overbuilt pre-Great Recession. Then there was a period of almost stagnation to no building between 2007 and 2014-ish. That stagnation to no building created a problem. We started building very slowly after that, ramping up to a time around COVID where we were getting to a good building cycle. That good building cycle around the COVID timeframe. Then we hit COVID. Internationally and overseas, there were some supply chain issues that were going on already at the time. That then, when COVID hits, exacerbated those supply chain issues. Notwithstanding the fact that when COVID hits, people are able to now work from home. They're looking for places that have, yards and 2 bedrooms that they can use as home offices, etc. So people moved to Arizona. That's one of the places they came. And then interest rates spike, which locks people into their home, and the housing ladder keeps people from rotating out of that. Right. And so I just felt like that story was never being told. I want to say, yes, housing supply does affect price, but I even think what we're seeing today, and I think that the NBER study reflects this. What we're seeing today is housing supply has never been higher than it has since 2014, in fact. And price, we're not seeing price obviously adjust itself back down to 2019 levels, right? I mean, the NBER study effectively said that the main tie to price is relative income levels of that particular region, not how zoning is handled in that region. And so we're not going, even if supply is high today, I think what we're seeing in correlation to that is is prices coming down slightly, but we're not going to see them come down to pre-2020 levels when 80% of homes in Maricopa County were sold for under 400,000 and 60% were sold for, 80% were sold for, under 400,000 and 60% were sold for under 300,000. So yes, supply does affect price, but the piece that I loved about the NBER study was I think that it was the first study that I'd seen that actually took relative income levels of the region and tried to analyze that in relation to affordability.
And before we move on to, I'd like to have Elliot maybe give any comment that he might have to the issue of supply. But before we do, you would also, I know that you had told me that you would like to also talk about things that the cities have been doing. So do you want to do that now, or would you like to do that as we're going through the rest of the show?
I mean, this just goes to kind of this conversation sort of not being told. And I think it's hard at the Capitol because we're always on the defensive sort of at the municipal level. I think this being a mayor, a former mayor, you sort of sit in your lane when you're in the city council seat and you try and focus on what you do well. And so in our municipalities, they tend to focus on the housing issue without the need for the legislature's interference. So we have that 270,000 unit housing number that dates back to 2019 data. Well, since January 2020, we have permitted 316,750 units in Arizona. 104,500 of them have been multifamily units. We fully constructed 249,000 units. During that period of time, we've been 6th in the nation in permitting, despite being 14th in population. So, and then on top of all of that, cities have been attempting to, and I know that you'll have comments about this later, but cities have been attempting to revise processes to make things streamlined, to make things more efficient. We supported legislation that tried to get the timelines down for rezoning requests. There were cities before legislation that was passed that 14 of the 16 cities that were impacted by the ADU legislation already had ADU allowances. Cities were reducing their lot sizes. Cities were reducing their setback requirements. Cities were already passing languages on middle housing. So we were doing all these things without the need for influence from the legislature. That doesn't mean that we're not open to conversations from the legislature, but the top-down approach, indiscriminate of sort of what's going on at the local level, I think is sometimes challenging because they don't always realize what we're already doing.
All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break this conversation into the same questions that we asked during that show to see if we can try to better understand the disagreement. I will tell you up front, my belief and my thesis, I've never seen it this bad. I've never seen the regulations, the rules, the timing. I think cities are extremely challenged right now. And I've spoken to lots of people in the industry, and there is a tremendous amount of frustration that's built up, which is why I think it ended up in the legislature. I think that there was political pressure bubbling up all around you. But again, let's break this down so that we can better understand it. And I'm just going to hit these two slides, and then I'm going to go to Elliot. The first one is that we played in our first show was, does housing supply affect price? In that, we mentioned two studies. The first one is the one done by the Federal Reserve. It said that it definitely, that the supply definitely affects price. And then the next one, which was a little more controversial, which was NBER. And NBER, this is their abstract that they put in the front of the paper, but they talk about the issue that it is affected by supply, but they believe that it's more affected by income levels, meaning the amount of money that someone makes inside of the city has an effect. Now, Elliot, I don't know if you want me to put your other slides up here, but certainly I'd like to get your comment on the issue both of the NBER study as well as supply.
Well, let me start with the I'm not here to argue how many angels are on a head of a pin. Basically, the NBER study it's an outlier. They admit it's an outlier. It's purely an academic study. Housing is a market of markets. I don't care what the supply demand situation is in Fargo, North Dakota. It doesn't affect Phoenix, Arizona. And I don't care how much money is going into Fargo, North Dakota, because nobody wants to live in Fargo, North Dakota. But if places that people want to live, you have to look at things that are constraining supply. And you would have to be living in a cave or not have any reality at all in terms of if you were in the development community, not to understand that what is going on is things are getting more politicized, and it's taking longer and longer to get stuff through cities, and that adds to costs. And those costs are not going to be eaten by the home builder generally. They're going to be eaten by whoever ultimately buys the house. And that's the unfortunate thing. And the reason that this comes up is because there's not much you can do about demand. I think that Nick's point of view that it's that housing is driven primarily by income levels and population flows. Yeah, obviously. But that supply only affects price a lot if there's a significant excess supply or a significant shortage. And that's one of that chart I sent you today, Paul, because that clearly shows that. So unfortunately for cities, there's what, Nick, 28 cities in the Phoenix metropolitan area? I forget the exact number. Some of the good ones are thrown in with some of the bad ones. And that's the unfortunate situation. To start with, let me say this. I do not believe a one-size-fits-all solution will work. I think that is the worst thing that could happen. And but I do think that cities have to re-examine the situation they are putting the development community in.
There are certainly things that constrain supply. So, you being a developer, you may disagree with me on some of these things. That's fine. But one of the things I find so interesting is, there are items that I've brought up to developers on suggestions on how we could get product to market faster. And those suggestions have instantly been met with absolutely not. So I'll give you an example. We have in the Valley a lot of folks, a lot of developers who are doing entitlement banking, land banking. And there are some of our communities who will grant entitlements for a period of 2 years. And if you don't exhaust that entitlement within the period of 2 years, you lose it. There are other communities who don't do that. And in those communities that don't do that, what happens is that entitlement, in some cases, turns over a period of 2 or 3 times before it ever actually gets constructed. And what we have in Maricopa County, and MAG sometimes does an analysis of this, is we have a number of units that is out there that have been approved with an assured water supply certificate if needed, so if it's single family, that have not been constructed. Because we have these sort of in these entitlement banking scenarios going on. Now, we don't control that at the local level, but what you can see here is a scenario where a municipality can say, well, wait a minute, I've entitled 7,000 units, 4,000 single family, 3,000 multifamily, but only 3,000 of them have been built because people are banking on these properties. And yet I have somebody coming in here and asking me to build another 1,500 multifamily units here and another 3,000 single family units there. And what's the density of those units going to be, and so on and so forth. And there's, so those are some challenges that we certainly run up against.
Yeah, but Nick, but So I'm going to just disagree with you on this starting point, and here's the disagreement. The reason that land bankers exist is because cities have extended out the process to get zoning so long and entitlements for so long that you can't get the home builders to be able to buy it up front. There are too many risks that are inherent in that. So effectively, if you know that you're going to, a home builder goes in and they decide that they're going to buy a piece of property, and then they're told, well, you got to go through the general plan, and that's going to take you 6 months to a year and a half. And then when you get done with that, you're going to go through the planning process, and that's anywhere from 9 months to 2 years. In my experience, both of those two things together, if you're any of the inner cities, it's 3 years to be able to get it done. And then you have to go out and you've got to permit it. And in your permitting process, you're going to have all different types of issues because it's not just the permit. You got to get a preliminary plat, you got to get a final plat, you have to work through with all the departments to get things done. You've created such a regulated process, you have to have a land banker in between because the markets aren't going to allow the home builders to take all those risks. If you could get a decision to people quicker, you actually could reduce the amount of land banking that is being done. So my first answer to this is the complaint about land bankers would work with me if I thought, well, maybe there's some group of speculators that have some inside information with the cities and they're getting a special deal by being able to get it done. They're the risk capital in an environment where no one really knows what the cities are going to do. And there are costs that are associated with that.
Respectfully, Paul, that may be certain scenarios, but that's not the scenario that happened in Goodyear, where the property was entitled 8 years ago. All the upzoning happened all the way back then. The permits were ready to be issued, and it's changed hands 3 times since then. That's not the case that happened in a property in Scottsdale that was rezoned 10 years ago. And
Wait. How do you know that's not the case? I'm not going to buy that. You don't know that during that risk period, you're giving me timeframes where people could have definitely taken so long that they ended up selling it because they couldn't continue to take the risk. How do you know that that's not true? I hear cities say this stuff all the time, and it's all based upon a simple notion. People with capital and profit are bad. And the answer is, no, they're not. They're playing a role. And usually those roles they directly relate to the amount of risk that you place through your regulations.
Not saying they're bad, just saying. So for example, the Scottsdale example that I was going to recite to you, the property sold at 11,000% profit over a period of 10 years because they sat on it for that period of time. And they advertised themselves that it was 11,000% profit. Same owner sat on it for that period of time. So they're not talking about the risk. They're talking about the reward, right? And so I'm just saying there are other. I will concede to you, okay, that your scenario exists, but I think that there should be some concession that my scenario also exists, right? And that there is a concession also in constraining supply. For example, I see a lot of people that try and compare us, Arizona, Phoenix in particular, to Houston, for example. Well, Arizona has 17% of our land privately held. Houston has virtually 100% of their land privately held. So why are we trying to compare these things? We are constrained by land, and in fact, the home builder's own lobbyist at a water conversation recently said that the biggest challenge to price for them is not zoning, it is land costs because of the limited amount of land available.
Okay, so you're going to have to take me back on this. What does 17% and 100% have to do with it? Because it could be 17% of a much larger denominator. So if you have, there's a raw amount of land that matters. And certainly we have a lot of land that the state still holds in the state
That's
land
true.
trust. And so we go through a process of being able to let that land out to builders who are on the peripheries. But I don't understand what that has to do with a city infill piece. that takes 3 years to
No,
get through the entitlement
you're right.
process.
No, and I think that those are two separate conversations. But we're talking about things that constrain supply, and part of the things that constrain supply. So let's look at, we're talking about a statewide problem, right? So part of the things that constrain supply, let's say in Flagstaff, for example, is that south of I-40 is basically the only area of land available. South of I-40 and east of Flagstaff is really the only land available for building out there. That's all state land, right? And so when we're talking about things that affect supply, we do need to get rid of some of that state land in order to build more. So I'm just talking about holistically, what are some things that constrain supply? And it is land availability is one of the things that does that. And I think Spencer Camps would concede that as well.
All right, so let's go to the, you wrote an article. I found this article to be interesting. You put a lot of data into it. I thought there were some really good facts in it. But there were also some things in there that to me didn't sit right. But if you would, talk to me about what you were trying to say in this article, if you can recall. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about the corporate interest component.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it just all goes back to the beginning of our discussion, which is how do we, I'm all about trying to have fact-based conversations. And, again, when I'm down at the Capitol, I hear people talking about, on the other side, about we don't build John F. Long properties anymore. They don't even look at what John F. Long did when he was building in Phoenix. John F. Long's first neighborhood that he built was 9,100 square feet. The average lot size was 9,100 square foot. Okay. The remaining homes that he built around Maryville, the average lot size was about 6,700 square feet. The reality is today in Maricopa County, and that's the reason I'm going to focus on that is because that's where we have the best data. In Maricopa County, about a little over 70% of all of our lots are not under 9,000 square foot in lot sizes. That includes some of our municipalities like Paradise Valley and Fountain Hills and elsewhere who have larger lot sizes. About 25% or so of our lot sizes are under 6,000 square feet in size. And so we are building small. We have the third smallest lot size in the country, median lot size in the country in Arizona. So we do build small. And I was just trying to get some of this information out there that tells the story about what we do and also just macroeconomically how we sort of got into this housing crisis, and talk also about how cities want to be at the table, but similar to what Elliot said before he unfortunately dropped off the call, we do not believe that a one-size-fits-all approach generally works, but we're happy to be at the table to discuss solutions to try and find what will work for Arizona going forward.
All right, so let me hit on the corporate interest here for a moment. And when I do this, there was a segment of this particular article. I believe it's readily available at. I know that it was available if you had the yellow sheets, but I also believe it's available on your website. So if people want to look at it, they can. And again, there was some good data in it. But one of the components dealt with what's going on with corporate housing. Now, to try and help on this, there are 3 types of corporate housing, or STRs, that I believe are being addressed, but Nick can correct me if I'm wrong when we get done. The one type is the type that's being bought by the Blackstones or the BlackRocks, where they have bought up a lot of older inventory. They really started doing that in 2008 when there were a lot of foreclosures going on, but they bought a significant amount of homes inside the process, or inside our city as well as others. The second one are things like Airbnb, where people rent out a room, or they rent out a casita in their backyard, or for that matter, maybe they rent out an entire house. And then the third type are the single family residences that are being built today, oftentimes a detached type of housing, but they're building them to rent them. Now, if we can, let's go to a couple of comments here because I thought these were interesting. Private equity and corporate interests have been purchasing more units in Arizona, reducing supply for first-time home builders, home buyers, and raising rents. The second one is short-term rentals reduce housing stock and they increase prices. And then the third one was fractional home ownership is just another way of corporations that keep people from buying. This makes me wonder whether or not you really do get the supply issue, because to me, in all three of these cases, the idea that you're hitting a corporation for this, or you're hitting corporate buying for this, it just doesn't make sense. If a group goes out and builds single family homes that they rent out, they are increasing supply. If someone rents out a room to someone who wouldn't be able to have a place to live otherwise, we're increasing supply. And so I'm trying to understand where you were coming from on this. It seemed like kind of a proverbial dig to just the whole idea of capitalism and private property rights. But help me understand what you were trying to say.
So let's be clear. Build to rent is the only one here that increases supply. Every other one that you've highlighted is existing supply that's being taken up by corporations that would otherwise be available for somebody else. Okay, so let's back up and let's see what we're talking about here. So corporate home ownership, and I'm not talking about. We've always had, I think, in the United States, we've always had an individual, Paul Johnson, Nick Ponder, whoever it is, who might own 1, 2, 3 properties and rent them out. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is this pervasiveness that really manifested, and I'm not even talking about what happened during the Great Recession. I'm really talking about this pervasiveness that actually has happened kind of around 2015 and after. There's been a significant commoditization of the housing market by folks like Blackstone and others during that period of time. So what we have is a scenario, and you can listen to me, you can listen to, segments on CNBC. There's a great segment done on 60 Minutes about this, where they interviewed the CEO of a company called Tricon, and they also interviewed people who are renters who were trying to buy. And what you find is that these corporations they're only buying first-time home buyer homes, because those are the ones that individuals who were previously renting, who are trying to buy, are looking to get into. And they're competing with those first-time home buyers. And those corporations are able to offer full cash offers, 15-day close, purchase as is. And the first-time home buyer is not able to do that. They might not even be able to offer 20% down. Now, that is capitalism. I'm not making an argument against capitalism, but if we are talking about items that constrain supply for first-time home buyers and that push up price, there is absolutely no argument that this does it. The argument at the Capitol is, we're not building homes for first-time home buyers anymore. Well, first-time home buyers aren't also able to get into the housing ladder anymore in those homes that were once for first-time home buyers, because corporations are buying them up. The short-term rental issue. So let's talk about that. The short-term rental issue in Scott.
No, let's stick with this one for a moment. We'll come back to this. We'll go through each one. So the next slide, if you just look at this for a moment, you talk about large portions of it. There's your portions, right? Your portions of this, it's about 1.7% of the total housing stock, and it's about 5% of the total renting stock. So I don't see that as being a large portion. And the second issue that I would point out on this is that to me, making a decision to look at this, taking a look at regulating somebody's property rights and ability to be able to buy this is really a distortion of capital allocation. So let's say that you did remove it, and let's say that when you removed it, instead of it being a corporation, a mom and pop bought it. Well, we know a couple of things from the mom and pops that buy these things. First one is oftentimes they don't put as much money into maintenance. We know the corporate guys actually do a better job of maintenance. They both rent them. I'm not certain that at the end of the day, changing this and getting it out of corporate hands, by the way, this is all STRs, including mom and pops. I'm not certain that you actually make any improvement. In fact, my guess is for tenants, it ends up being a worse deal. And so it's not just new home buyers, both renters and new home buyers have been hit. In fact, I would argue that if you look over the last 5 or 6 years and you look at the inflation issue, for the most part, home buyers weren't hit real hard. If you were in a home, you were doing fairly well. Renters got hit very, very hard. Well, partly that is driven by the amount of supply of rental units that are on the marketplace. If you have less rental units on the marketplace, I guarantee you prices are going to go up. So the idea that you have corporate ownership of these rentals, I don't see it as playing a negative role. I see it as playing a positive role in that it kept more rental units on the marketplace, which helped the supply and demand issue with them. Your response?
First off, the data here, I'm not quite sure. So first off, the argument that, let's just go back to the argument about does supply affect price? I don't care if it's 1.7% or 5%. You know, according to an article from Law 360, who went through and analyzed every single property owned by every one of these entities in Phoenix, Arizona, what they said was that 20% of the for-rent single-family homes, 20% of the for-rent single-family homes have corporate ownership. So if we're looking at having the opportunity to put those homes on the market, and that's 5,000 homes, that's going to impact price. And these people, I don't want to create the comparison between a corporate landlord versus, you know, a mom and pop landlord or somebody else. That's not the comparison here. The comparison here is the individual versus the corporate landlord. And frankly, I don't care whether the individual, does a renovation on their home. That's up to them. Whether they do a renovation or do the upkeep on their home, their goal is to get into home ownership to build equity, not to build equity for the corporation, right? And so I think the point that I'm trying to make here is every single time, and I posted a chart on this on social media. I didn't print it out for whatever reason, but you can track in by quarter. You can track as the percentage of corporate sales or investor sales increases, the price increases equally. So, for example, in 2021, 31% of all sales in Arizona were investor sales, and you see the spike in investor sales in Arizona, and you correspondingly see the same spike. The trend line is equal in Arizona from the corporate spike in purchases to the spike in price. And
what do you think would happen to corporate ownership if we had triple the amount of apartments that had been built and we had an excess of rental supply of 20%? I can tell you what would happen. They wouldn't be able to buy them at the higher price. They would be in a position where they wouldn't keep raising the price. You're allocating the blame for those price raises to the corporate guy that's buying them, not the idea that there is a huge amount of people that want to rent them. And when they want to rent them, they want to rent them because they're looking for a place to rent. That drives up rental rates. These guys all buy on cap rates. They don't come in and say, we're going to buy these units and we don't really care what the market is. We're going to drive it up to the market that we think that it will be. They take a look at what the units will rent for, and depending upon what the cost of money is in the marketplace, they're able to buy units, and they're able to do that based upon what they think the rental demand is going to be in an area. And why do we have a rental demand? Because we haven't built enough rental
So
units.
I have 2 points here, and then I think we can agree that we're not going to agree here. But they rent because there's no alternative. They rent because they can't get into a buying opportunity because the private equity has purchased it out from under them. And we can't build.
Nick, if you're a nurse, nurse and you're going to spend 1 year in this market, you think that person wants to buy a unit?
So
you're telling me that all these people who live in these rental units, really they want to be a buyer. By the way, I wish that were true.
No,
but it's not, because I've dealt with rental units and I've dealt with for sale units. For the most part, they're different people. And if people, I can tell you what's going on with the new home buyer. There's a variety of issues going on. But for the most part, it has nothing to do with the idea that they would buy the rental that they were in if they just
I'm
could.
not going to tell you that a nurse who's here for a year should buy, but I'm also going to tell you that the Phoenix metro area has been first or second in the country for the last handful of years in multifamily construction. What I can also tell you is that the multifamily industry has told me directly that they are not going to build in Maricopa County for a period of time because they're overbuilt, because vacancy rates are going up. So, yes, we have a housing shortage. They're not philanthropists. You know this, Paul. They're in it to make money. So vacancy rates are going up. We still need them to build, but they're not going to request as many permits to build today because they know that vacancy rates are going to are going up, and they are not going to be able to generate as much rent as they need to today versus what they will be able to in the future. So we're never going to be able to build as quickly as corporations are going to be able to buy. And so there's always going to be that imbalance and that inequity in the system. And so there has to be some alternative. And let me just say this last point here, which is that the corporate ownership model has only recently been incentivized. So to talk about this sort of capitalism thing where am I against capitalism? No. But just keep in mind that the federal government, through tax incentives, has only recently incentivized these models for this type of corporate ownership through some of our federal schemes. So we've sort of done it to ourselves. And getting rid of that doesn't make you anti-capitalist. I wouldn't say that in 2005 we were anti-capitalist because we didn't have this particular incentivization for corporate ownership of single-family housing.
So what's the solution? I'll give you the last word on this one, then we'll move to fractional ownership. So what's your solution to that? What is it that you'd like to see the legislature do or the federal government that would do that somehow or another might stop these corporate interests from buying?
So I think there's a difference between short-term rentals and long-term rentals. First off, on short-term rentals, I think a very easy thing is, and I think you can treat short-term rentals differently than long-term rentals because the federal government treats them differently. The federal government treats short-term rentals as active income versus long-term rentals, which are passive income. So they are not like taxpayers, and so we can treat them differently, and we should treat them differently. Now, how we treat them differently, I think we need to, in every single way, treat short-term rentals like transient lodging. In Arizona,
like what?
Like transient lodging.
So transient lodging, that would be like homeless lodging. Is that what you're talking about?
No, like hotels. So
okay.
in Arizona, the state legislature preempted us in 2016 in being able to regulate short-term rentals, bringing back some of that local authority and how we can limit the number of, the density of, and the location of short-term rentals would probably be some wisdom for the legislature to do, because we're the only place in the country that has those levels of restrictions. With respect to both short-term rentals and long-term rentals, with respect to corporate ownership, I think they should really look into something as it relates to the assessment ratio on these units, and how that type of ownership should be treated differently than individual ownership of homes, and try and
All right, so
property taxes.
let's just stick with this so that I have a chance to comment on it. Then you can go back to the corporate ownership as opposed to these fractional interests. So effectively, what you're saying is create an incentive so that when we decide that we want to go, let's say every city did this, we want to go to San Diego and rent a home, we wouldn't be able to do so. People who want to go to Williams or Sedona and rent a home, they basically wouldn't be able to do so. Or if they did, the taxes would be so high that it would be pretty much prohibitive, and it would force the owner to rethink whether or not they would rent those homes.
Well, I think the state always controls what the property tax rate is. So the state would determine what the rate was. And I don't think that the state would make it a prohibitive rate. But it would be a rate that would be higher than your individual property tax rate. Okay. That might limit the number of them, but also allow the municipality to limit the number of them. So not ban them.
And you see the idea of people who are utilizing housing on a transient basis as being less important. You see it, the vacation rental. You see that as being somehow or another a net negative for society.
Absolutely. I mean, Sedona. So 20% of the housing stock in Sedona is taken up by short-term rentals. They don't have areas for their teachers to live. And so Sedona is one.
Oh, Nick. Wait, Nick. Wait a minute, Nick. I love Sedona. I love Williams. But these cities have done everything they could to limit every single development that was coming into their areas. God bless them. That's their municipal right. But you're going to blame short-term rentals on the fact that their housing prices are too high? I mean, those areas are far and away the worst. And again, I understand it. They want to preserve their environment. They want to protect the natural beauty that's there. But their problem with housing isn't coming from their short-term rentals, or if it is, it's a very small portion of it. It's because the elected leaders there by design have created that environment. You can't go out and impose those types of rules and then somehow or another blame the poor schmuck who's renting his house.
I don't think that's a fair assessment. I mean, let's first talk about Sedona. Sedona is 100% surrounded by federal land. Okay, so they can't grow. But let's also say that why do you move to Sedona? You move to Sedona for the views, right? And so you as an elected official, I mean, you as the elected official in Sedona, Paul, are you going to make the decision to build a 4-story apartment complex that's going to block, 200 neighbors' view of Bell Rock? I mean, is that your decision, knowing that the local residents are not going to support that? I mean, at the end of the day,
I'm just saying it's unfair to blame then the fractional homeowner.
No.
Yeah, I get it. They want to preserve their views. They move there. They don't like the idea that more people are going to move there. They don't want to build the motel. They don't want to build the hotel. They don't want to see the state land department. The state land department could help our schools quite a bit if we took some of the land around Sedona and put it back out into the marketplace. And I promise you, there'd be a big, long list of home builders that would show up to buy that land and build more homes. And that would have an effect on affordability. The answer is they don't want that. Good. Okay. I'm not complaining about them wanting that. I've never complained about them wanting that. But then to blame the guy who's leasing out his house so that he can help pay his mortgage rate for being the guy that caused the problem on housing, that seems incredibly unfair.
We're not talking about. I'm not talking about the seasonal owners. I'm talking about the number of homes, and we're not talking about seasonal owners, Paul. We're talking about homes in Sedona that are rented out full time. That has exploded. I'm not talking about fractional ownership, and so these people that has come in and dominated the framework of what can happen there. I will let you know that Sedona,
It's still the same argument that I would make, which is blaming them for the fact that the community has decided that they don't want any further growth, and that I mean, there's Sedona for a long time has had a higher than average housing price per square foot. Why? Scarcity creates demand. That's just the rule, right? If you have a place where housing is scarce or where it's more difficult to get something, the price is higher. And again, I love Sedona. It's a beautiful place. I love visiting there. In fact, wouldn't mind renting a house for a week there because I like going up there. It's a part of the state that is wonderful. I don't know why you would want to limit people from doing that. That's different than saying you have a bad tenant who's not being respectful of his neighbors. I do understand that. That's important for people to be able to know that they can live in their neighborhood with peace. But you're attacking so many other values by stopping someone from being able to rent their home. Everything from property rights issues to other tenants being able to enjoy it as
just
well.
first and foremost, they didn't have that property right before 2016. Okay, that the state stripped that restriction from local governments, and I would just rephrase it and say that residents are not trying to prohibit. They're not necessarily trying to prohibit apartments from coming in. They're trying to protect their investment, which is their view, right? That's why you move to Sedona. But I will also point out that Sedona has taken 14% of their budget for the last 2 years, and they will continue to do it. It's about $12 million a year. They've taken 14% of their budget and saved it up to purchase any available land so they can build apartments because they're trying to help resolve this issue. There's just no land available. And it's not, you mentioned state land. It's not state land, it's federal land. So there's no state land that's going to become available. It's only federal land. So they have to wait until somebody's willing to sell available land around there, purchase it, and then build apartments on that land. But the city's trying to do that through setting money aside, 14% of their budget, to purchase land whenever it becomes available.
All right. So let's move on to the next topic here. And I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Does housing supply affect the homelessness? I can't imagine that you would have had any argument with this section of it. I'm just going to go through very quickly the slides that we had on it. If you do, feel free to speak up. But housing, the NLIHC, which is the National Low Income Housing Coalition, said that housing supply constraints can impact adult homelessness. Many cities failed to connect restrictive land use policies with homelessness. Pew did an item on zoning reforms can mean more homes and lower costs for Arizona. But there's a lot of studies on this that actually talk about, and there's a great book that was written on it. I'll put the book up in the show notes. But the idea that it almost doesn't matter what price range of housing you build, it actually ends up helping people who are homeless. The idea if you only are building the A units, that ends up assisting in that the existing A unit starts to become Bs, and Bs start to become Cs, and Cs Ds, and Ds start to become areas where the housing costs ends up being lowered for people who are at the lowest economic rung. And so before we get to this, Nick, I would imagine you don't have any issues on that, but if you do, feel free to speak up.
No, in general, no. I mean, I think, I think you mentioned at one point in time you might want to talk about impact fees. So if that's coming up, I'm prepared to have that conversation.
Good. All right. So does zoning and permitting regulations affect the cost of housing supply? I'm just going to hit these really quick. The regulatory controls of cities include the zoning, the planning, the permitting, the use permit, and inspections. And each one of these have a different effect. Zoning is generally is both the amount of time as well as what type of zoning categories do you give people. Do you give them the ability to build higher density, medium density, or low density? Permitting can be a wide variety of different issues, which I'll go through some slides in a moment. Use permits are oftentimes what you'll find with cities. is that they utilized the use permit as a way to constrain people further. There was a legal analysis done in California that found cities with restrictive zoning had 2.5 times fewer new housing units compared to less restrictive areas, driving up the price. The Brookings Institute found that restrictive zoning increased home prices by 30 to 50% in major metro areas like New York and San Francisco. NAHB found that the regulatory delays in permitting costs account for over 25% of the final price. I'm going to show you something that will reflect this in a moment. Federal Reserve found that excessive regulations in some cities increase housing costs by as much as $200,000 per home. A case study found that in Boston versus Houston, Houston, where there was less zoning issues, found that it reduced labor mobility losses and economic development, and it found that it increased cost and homelessness. Now, I did my own study. Now, this is based upon a real case study, but I updated it to today's numbers. I'll try to give you the difference between what my numbers were and what the new numbers are to try to better understand it. This related to the city costs as it's related to about a $300,000 home. And $300,000, as hard as it seems to me, is now considered an entry-level home. A $300,000 home is a home that today, even with today's interest rates, a nurse could afford. This is based on my actual experience in the individual home cost in Phoenix, land, plan, specs, construction, and marketing cost. It's based upon, again, a $300,000 home. All right, permitting cost per home. This is an actual cost. Actually, on the last subdivision that we had, ours was a little bit higher than this. It was about $24,000 for that home that could have run for about $300,000, but $18,000 is what you would see that the city advertises. However, when I spoke about use permits a moment ago, the more use permits you have, the higher those costs can go. Next. The impact fees. The impact fees, when we did ours, were lower. They've just been raised. I can show you a slide in a moment. They range depending upon the area, but an impact fee today can be as high as $32,000 for an impact fee. Now, here's kind of what's interesting about that. We can talk about it when Nick has a chance to join on this. When I got my first home as a new home buyer, the city paid for my streets. The city paid for my park. The city paid for my water and my sewer line. If you're a new home buyer today in any of those areas, the city's view is you ought to pay for your own. Those ought to be costs that are borne by you. That, to me, is an important policy discussion and one that we ought to spend more time thinking about. That's not such a big number if you're talking about $1 million home or a $1,500,000 home, but on a $300,000 home, it starts to matter. This is the difference of zoning of single-family detached housing. And let me try to tell you how I got to this number so you can figure out whether or not you think it's fair or not. So if you had 8 units to the acre on a particular piece of property, which when Nick was talking about the size of lots, that'd be about a 6,000, 7,000 square foot lot, you would be about $50,000 a unit. If you are able to get that to 16, where you can still do a single family detached house with a yard, that drops the price to $25,000. The land cost stays fairly constant, but the house price or the price ends up being reflected in the house itself. Time and cost to zone and permit. Now, this is $19,500. This time relates to before you get to the permit, you don't have a loan yet on the hard cost, but you still have effective costs that you have to cover. If you're raising equity, there's a cost to that equity. Equity is not free. The time frame here ends up being the longest, and there's a risk attached to it, which is why you end up oftentimes having people that do land banking. And this is the area where they end up spending most of their money in terms of these land bank situations because it's hard to judge what the time will be. But I can tell you, to get a property planned and zoned, you're talking about, depending upon which city, 18 to 24 months. And permitting can take you anywhere from 9 months 9 months to a year and a half. Now, some of that time relates to your people, your architect time, your engineering time, the time that things that go back and forth. What we did on ours is we just simply applied the cost to the actual cost that we had to have in exhibits and other costs, as well as the amount of time when only the city had our process. The time for inspections. This is $322 a day. It's really not hard to figure out. It's almost exactly what your interest carry is times 60 days. What happens in the inspection time is that when you go out and you have, I'll go through some inspection processes in a moment, but when you go through an inspection, you usually are down for about a half a day, depending upon which part of the process that you're in, sometimes a full day. If you get a red tag, maybe 2 days, and that ends up allocating out in an amount of time. I think most builders would tell you that this was fairly conservative and that generally it's longer than that. But related to the interest carry and the actual cost, it's $19,320. Offsite cost not related to the project. In this particular project that I looked at, it was actually one of our lowest costs for offsites. But what happens with the cities today is increasingly they want, they like to say the developer to pay for the cost of the development, for the offsite costs. That's if you go and you have to tie into the sewer line, of course you would have to pay to tie into the sewer line. Of course you have to fix the street, but they may make you do an entire half street. They may make you do slurry on half the street. They may look at the old sidewalks and say, well, some of these sidewalks are cracked. We want you to tear all the sidewalks out. That tends to depend upon both the inspector as well as the city and how they look at it. However, those costs end up being costs that are effectively passed on to the home because that's, these costs are, at the end of the day, the only real absorption ends up being either profit or it comes into the development side. So let's take a look at the total of these costs so you can begin to kind of understand what that looks like. By the way, this was the city slide on in terms of development impact fees on the home. If people are interested, they can slow down the video and they can take a look at what those were.
Can I ask why you're allocating the $25,000 to the city for the difference in the zoning?
Absolutely. To begin with, if a city makes a decision that they're going to cut zoning in half, that is either borne out by the land or the project.
Oh, so you're
done.
saying the city downzoned this particular property for zoning?
No, I'm saying that so what you're doing is you're assuming that zoning is a privilege. It's not. It's not by law, right? By law, it's a police power that's given to the city, and they're not allowed to be arbitrary and capricious in that process. And so the question is, what is the appropriate zoning for that area? Now, I can tell you, get 4 neighbors to show up, they're going to give you a very different density than if no neighbors show up. It's just the way it works, right? And by the way, anything I blame cities for today, I want to make certain I'm clear on this, I have been equally guilty of. I was mayor, right? So I'm not pointing at any one city or any one mayor or any one council. I understand these issues on both sides. But if you decide that you're going to give a lower density, it doesn't change the cost of the land. You may not buy it. You may move on to the next piece. But effectively, the land has a certain value in today's market. And what ends up taking place is if the city says, no, we'll give you what would work in that particular area. It fits within the general plan. The general plan says that that's okay. It can literally have an effect of cutting in half the cost of what it takes to develop. Now, again, you talked about land bankers a moment ago. All right, well, let's just say that you cut the land banker out, you had the home builder do it. And in our case, that's exactly what happens. We're home building. We're not land banking. The answer is that just becomes a direct cost to the home. So all costs except to the city, $300,000. City cost, $116,000. So for a $300,000 home, you add those all up, you end up with this one, $416,000 house. The city, I'm not trying to say, this isn't the blame issue. This is on a house that could go for $300,000. You're obviously going to have some city costs. What those should be, you can argue. But the cost has gotten to the point where there's a large amount of this, an increasing amount of this that's being given back to the home builder saying, you need to cover these costs. Well, I could market a home in that area for $300,000, but when you got done with the city cost, it's somewhere up at 416. That's about a 25, well, depending upon how you do your math on this, but it's about a 25% off of the 416 that's coming from cost given by the city. Now, I just want you to look at these inspections. First, offsite inspections. Now, on offsite inspections, these are all the things that you have to do when you're building on offsites. But here's the lovely part about these offsites. Happens all the time. Talk to any builder, you'll find out that this is true. You go build you go get your plans, you take them through the city, they go through the city desk, they give you all the things that they want you to do, they tell you what's important. You take it out, you start to try to build it. You meet with the offsite inspector. Now, the inspector that you meet with matters. One offsite inspector will say you can do less. Another offsite inspector will say that you need to do more. But I love this part. More than once, multiple times, on many sites, and I hear this from a lot of developers, the offsite inspector will say, I don't care what the people at the city desk said. I'm not going to approve this. Go back and get it redone. Or you're going to have to do more work than they told you that you're going to have to do. Or you're going to have to tear up more than they thought that you're going to have to tear up. Now you have a choice. Delay your project and go back through the process, try to get the city involved, actively engage people at whatever level you have to, or just go along with them. But I can tell you that ends up in real dollars being paid out for those offsites, oftentimes because the inspector thinks he's doing a good thing by trying to push for more for the city, and he thinks that the people at the front desk are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. These are on-site. These two on-sites are really interesting because you talk about changes that have happened. These are changes that relate to landscaping, and I love this. They want you to go out and inventory the trees. Now, oftentimes, those trees were weeds 2 years ago. Right? But now they call it a tree or a palo verde or whatever it was. You bought the property. Now they want you to take it, box out this landscaping, put it to the side. The death rate of these plants has to be 75 to 80%. Very, very few of them really end up surviving. For the most part, if you just planted twice as many trees as opposed to trying to save these, you'd end up with a prettier looking site at about a tenth of the cost. But it's just simply something they're not going to deal with. Nick, are you trying to ask a question?
I feel like a translator in a post-game interview trying to respond to a run-on sentence. Like, no offense, but like there's a lot to unpack here. Am I going to get time to respond to the prior thing as well?
Oh, you could, but yeah, I'm sorry. If you would like, let me finish this because this was the last slide that I had on this. And if you want to, if you ask specifically, you can say, hey, will you go back to XYZ slide? We'll go back on any slide that you would like to. So these are just the traditional inspections. Again, the inspector makes a difference, but these are mostly on the site and what's being done there. But again, all of these take time. All of these take effort. And a number of these are new inspections that they used to not do. The last one is interesting because it goes back to plants. So let's say that you're going to put in landscaping on a site. And when you go to put the landscaping in on a site and you have 40, 50, 60 homes, sometimes the inspector will say, well, just put the plants in as you go, and then I'll give you the C of O so that you can get the first houses sold or rented or do whatever you're doing with them. But sometimes the inspector takes the lovely position of saying, not until every piece of landscaping is done on the very last house am I going to give you the ability to be able to get a C of O on the first house. Well, guess what? Your interest carry just went up. The amount of time that you're spending on it just went up. Again, if this were just us on one side, I'd say, okay, no big deal. But I'm telling you, this thing is a bigger mess than I've ever seen it. Now, Nick, I know you had some comments or questions. I'll go back through any of the slides that you'd like to, and we can talk more in detail.
Yeah, so I appreciate it. So just to get back previously to the price, and we don't necessarily need to go back to the slide unless you want to. So we had a economist do an analysis of what the municipal impact or the municipal cost is to a home. Now, I'll have to go back through that analysis. I don't know if they included impact fees, and I think that there's a reason an argument not to include impact fees, but that analysis was a range from anywhere between 10 and 15%. Now, I think the argument not to include impact fees is because if you don't include impact fees, then all of those residents that you have who have already paid for their home are in effect subsidizing new development. And the impact that those new residents have on the community. I think, that's the comment.
Where do you live now?
I live in Phoenix, just north of Piestewa Peak.
Piestewa Peak. Okay. So I live near Northern and Central. Somebody subsidized mine long time ago. Somebody subsidized everybody in the inner city.
And so,
and let me get you to look at these numbers. And I apologize for interrupting you, but let me get you to look at these numbers just a little differently, because this was really my hope. It's not to say, look at how terrible a job you're doing, cities. It was to say to the cities, hey, if you really want lower cost homes, if you really care about those people who are working as your janitors or your police officers or your firefighters, if you take a look at these numbers, these are real areas you could make an impact on if you wanted to. You may not want to, but if you wanted to, every one of these categories I've given you have an effect. And the effect that they have could lower the price of the home that's being sold. Again, back to the homes that I'm showing you, we marketed them at about $450,000. I can tell you, if you took those costs and you reduced them, you could reduce the price of what you would be selling a home. But you got to look at all those issues. It's possible to say, well, the only thing that we care about is the permitting fees that we charge. Well, you might want to look at how many permits you're issuing.
And the truth is, we would likely not be able to reduce the costs below a certain level because we'd run into gift clause issues. We cannot.
No, you wouldn't. I know the gift clause inside and out. And I can tell you this would not be a gift clause issue. I'm not talking about going back to a builder and saying, here's something that we'll give you to reduce it. I'm talking about the city thinking about, do we care about trying to provide a home that's affordable for people? And if we could get the entry-level housing to go from what now is somewhere above 450,000 down to 300,000 through some type of incentive program that looked at those issues, you would have builders that would step up to do it. Now, if most of those issues, by the way, they're not real costs. Well, I take it back. They are real costs, but you could reduce those costs where the city wouldn't be putting nearly as much into it. But you have to think about those topics. And if you don't, if your answer is no, we're not going to think about those because we don't care about really affordable housing. No,
it's not because we don't care. We've talked to the attorneys about certain things that we can do. I'm telling you that I don't think that we can. On the 25.
Yeah, he's wrong. Whatever lawyer you're talking to about the issues I'm talking about, I will put a group of lawyers in front of you, and they will point out to you that that is not what the gift clause says. You couldn't give, if I were coming to you saying, hey, Nick, will you give me back my permit fees? You might have an argument that it's a gift clause issue. You will not have an argument if you say, you know what we're going to do? For affordable housing, we're going to try to find a way to reduce the amount of inspection time, the amount of permitting time, the amount of zoning time, the amount of rules and regulations that we put into place. You could create a program. It just needs to be universal. And in fact, I would recommend to do it universally as opposed to doing it on a one-by-one developer basis.
I'm not talking about timeliness. I'm talking about getting rid of fees or something like that. Now, with respect to the $25,000, I don't think that that's a fair assessment to the city because it seems to me that you're allocating a cost to the city because you didn't get the zoning that you wanted versus the zoning that you got. I don't think that that's
okay. So let's make certain we play this out. So you have a place on the general plan that the general plan said that you could build 16 or 20 units to the acre, and you give them 8. Your thought is that's the developer's fault.
I don't know what the general plan said. I know that the general plan.
I'm being hypothetical. I'm being hypothetical.
Well, I know that the general plan obviously is a long-term document that eventually you can get to 16 units per acre. At the time that you were looking to develop there, Maybe it can't support that 16 units per acre. You're asking for it at a point in time where the underlying zoning may be for 4 or 6 units per acre, so maybe you get 8. I mean, that's sometimes what happens.
And all I'm saying is, if you bought a piece of property, again, here we are trying to work on trying to make housing affordable. We're trying to create a way to do that. And you say, hey, we can do that, but we're going to have to do that with lower density. The answer is, then you're going to add cost to the cost of the home. It's really that simple. If you say we're going to increase the amount of density, you're going to lower the cost. So, and by the way, that's a general statement that I think is almost always true. The idea that you end up increasing density will end up lowering cost on the development. And if the goal here was, we're going to take a look at how are we going to make housing more affordable for especially entry-level products, of course you should look at that issue, because it's an issue that will make a difference in the cost of the actual home. Ignoring it would be just ignoring regular economics.
And we're talking about the numbers you put in front of me. So what I'm saying to you is I think it would be fair to allocate a cost to the city if you somehow got a zoning that was less than the underlying zoning when you purchased the property. Not what the general plan zoning was for 10 years from now, but less than what the underlying zoning. Now, you have an expectation when you purchase the land that you're going to try and get a different zoning type, knowing that the zoning type at the time that you purchased it was X. There's some middle area that maybe you can get to, but allocating a cost to the city for not getting what you wanted to get, I don't think necessarily is fair.
Okay, so again, let's go back to saying the goal here was to try to figure out how do we end up helping the city think about lower housing. Here's number 2. So Houston has no zoning. So I could go to 8, 12, 16 units to the acre. The city put zoning into place. I understand it. I do understand it. And I understand the value to it as well. But you do understand that's taking something away the minute we put zoning into place, right?
It's not
zoning didn't always exist. Zoning is something that is today it's a statutory creature, but it was created by legislation years ago, and it's been through the court system. But it took value away. That's why these court cases like Nolan Dolan and other cases have all gone through this kind of property rights experience, trying to figure out what are the actual property rights that someone has. But zoning in itself is when you act as if that the city gave you this zoning and it's God, and the guy who owned the property, he's just somebody that's subservient to the city. And my answer to that is no, you have some expectation of what should be right. But setting all that aside, that's a property rights argument. Let's just make the argument of, could you make a difference in making housing more affordable?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. And zoning is going to come into play on that.
So on the permitting, the slide that we're looking at now, I think you would agree, municipalities effectively, we have one main job, and that is to protect public health and safety. Now, you can make an argument that some of these are not to protect public health and safety, but what I can say is we're not making our policies, just like most laws at the state level, just like most ordinances at the local level, they are not for the 98%, they're for the 2%. And unfortunately, that's what we have to do. But when we're responding as a municipality, we can't discriminate in how we're looking at these projects. We have to take a look at them.
Sure. Let's play that out, because that's a good point. So let's play that out. Let's think about this. So to begin with, it's the Universal Commercial Code. It's pretty much drawn up at the federal level, not at the city and state level. The city and state add things on top. They add things on top that may come from a zoning stipulation. It may come from their landscaping requirements. It may come from architectural reviews that they put into place. But there are things that are added on top, and the inspections affect that. But let's just take the inspection level. Let's look at an easy one. I'll just use a simple example. Let's say you had to go build a 20-foot long by 12-foot high wall, right? You got to build this wall, you got to go build the footer, and then you've got to put steel in the footers, and then you got to build this wall 12-foot high. Now, here's one way you could do that. You can have a third-party inspection. A third-party inspection would be an engineer that would come out, literally, he'll stay with you there the whole day, and you could build that 12-foot high wall, 20-foot long in about 2 days. The inspector would watch the steel going in. He could take pictures of it. He could send pictures to the inspectors. And oh, by the way, the city doesn't guarantee anything. When they do an inspection, if you do it wrong, they have no liability. But a third-party inspector, if he does something wrong and doesn't end up getting it correct, he can lose his license. Well, now let's go to how it works. Go dig the footer, put in the steel, call the city. Wait 24 hours for them to show up. They come out and they didn't like the steel, or your superintendent wasn't there when they were there, you get a red tag. So maybe you get an extra day. Then when you get it passed, pour the concrete, build the next 4 foot, call the inspector out. Send your guys home, guys doing the masonry, wait for 24 hours, let them come out and do the inspection, and build the next 4 feet. You do that all the way till you get to the top of that wall. That takes that wall from being a 2-day process to literally being an 8, 9, 10-day process with people having to start and stop. Yeah, you're right. We need to make certain that steel's in that wall. Why? Because if the steel's not in that wall, it could collapse and kill someone. I'm in. I believe that what we have for a commercial code is of value. But Nick, why do you think we really haven't changed that process? Because I can tell you why, because I was there. Because at the end of the day, the employees are afraid they're going to lose their job. Nobody's gone out and sold them on a better mission. The idea that maybe we don't have to put the amount of time into these inspections. Maybe we can make this easier on people by looking at third-party inspections. No one is really looking at how do you make this easier? And I'm going to go back to the goal. How do we create a cheaper home? How do we create something that works for people?
Yeah.
I'll give you another example. Streets, right? On streets today, arbitrarily, last week, city said, you know what? For single-family homes, we're no longer going to allow private streets. Oh, well, good. You now have a single-family street, private street that would have been 20 feet. Now it's got to be 24 feet. Now you got to put in curb, gutter, sidewalks, got to be developed to MAG standards. All right. Why? The streets department didn't like it. They've done this once before. Last time they did it, last time I was involved with it, they did it with sanitation. No, by the way, when they made the change, if you had your final plats done, completed, they said, oh, too bad. You can go back and start over. So you have hundreds of thousands of dollars done into the work and it has to start over. I can tell you why again. Because we think that DSD works for the departments. They don't think their customer is the person that's doing the building. So the streets department or the water department or sewer department start to complain. They feel like it's DSD's job to respond to them. Maybe what ought to happen is somebody ought to empower DSD and say, no, if they're going to make a change, they have to respond to them. They have to go through a process. The process has to create a set of changes that make sense, done on a timely basis, and that don't affect people in the process. But when you don't care about the customer, I can tell you what happens. All these things that I've given to you here, you create massive inefficiencies. And it's not being done because we're trying to protect against earthquakes and hurricanes and fire. I agree with you. We should do that. That's not what's happening. It's being driven based upon a set of assumptions that just quite simply aren't being done to help the end user, the person who's going to buy that home at a cheaper price.
So I'm going to disagree with you on it's not to protect the user. I do think that there is a good intent there. And I've talked to our departments about this. I think there's strong intent there. We think at the end of the day, there are two customers in this. It's the builder, but it's also the buyer or the renter at the end of the day, right? And so those are two folks that we have to focus on. I want to go back to one thing super quick because I remember Elliot mentioning it the last time you guys had a call, and you mentioned it again here. You talked about trees. Now, I just want to get to the why, because I think anybody listening to this will say, well, that's stupid. Why do you have to inventory your trees? So, as you know, we have a massive heat island effect here in Arizona. So when I talked to our city developers, city planning departments about this issue and asked them, why do we have folks inventory the trees? What I was told was, we want to figure out how much shade cover we have so that we ensure that when we are taking out that amount of shade cover, we replace that amount of shade cover so that we're not adding to the heat. That's effectively the rationale. You can disagree with that rationale, but that is the rationale, that we're not adding new pavement. We are adding new pavement.
I don't disagree with the rationale. I would tell you, do it more
Yeah.
efficiently. So let me give you an example. Instead of telling people, take the big tree out and box it, take a look at the fact that it's a Palo Verde that will grow to that height in about 2 years. And if you say, well, you could box it, but if you don't want to box it, you could replace it 2-to-1 with a smaller tree, with a smaller caliper tree, right? So that you're not creating a cost that doesn't matter, and that you're getting twice the amount of coverage. It may take a year, but yeah, you're getting twice the amount of coverage in it. So the answer is that we've created, again, another department and another set of needs, and they don't think like a builder at all. You're right, they're thinking about the landscaping. What they're not thinking about is what's the most efficient way to get to the possible goal that utilizes what's going to happen in the private sector and that helps us keep a lower price for the home builder, but still gets us the same or maybe even more trees.
So I'm going to agree with you in the sense that there are things that we can talk about. And this goes back. So one of the things that was said in your last meeting is that you were part of a group called Home Arizona, but you kind of feel like it hasn't been effective. I tend to disagree with that, but we can disagree on that. The reason I disagree with that is because I know of things that are happening internally within our cities. So you know that we had a meeting on October 23rd at the League of 2023 at the League, where we sat down, and it was a very cathartic conversation between developers and cities about, cities, these are the issues that cities have with developers, things that we thought that developers were doing wrong. And then developers had a cathartic conversation of things that they felt the cities were doing wrong. We felt that developers were building to designs that they wanted versus building to the code. Developers felt like cities were, to your point, taking too much time in some of these processes. And we had a lot of these conversations. You felt like cities weren't customer service focused, and maybe it was a misalignment of who the customer was, and because we're thinking of the customer as the end user, the person who lives there, right? We're gonna, what I can tell you is, we're gonna, with all due respect, we're gonna sacrifice efficiency every single time for public health and safety. Now, we can disagree that on, I know you, Paul, want to build a tremendous product for your customers, right? So how do we get there? And what I can tell you is that I know that the city of Phoenix, for example, is working on rolling out processes focused on a customer service program that for developers, right? That they're going to work on. I know that they are working on having periodic sit downs with developers, and both on the single family and multifamily side, to figure out where those pain points are and to figure out how those pain points can be addressed. I know that cities have, instead of sort of throwing you to the wind as a developer and trying to have you figure out the process on your own, have assigned project leads to individual projects and helped you walk through the process in individual departments. So a lead helps you go through that individual process and take you through that, because that is customer service focused, as opposed to having you go from department to department to department. So And then Phoenix in particular is initiating a training program with their inspectors and engineers so that they can try and make sure that there's alignment in some of these areas that you're talking about. Is everybody aware of these things? Maybe not. But these are all things that are born out of those conversations that we've had. Is the answer running to the legislature? No. And I think that from my perspective, no. And I think part of the problem that I have is we had that meeting on October 23rd of 2023. And then not 2 months later, did we see legislation, not necessarily from Home AZ as an entity, but some of the individuals who were in the room as part of Home AZ who also contribute to the home builders of Central Arizona, those participants supporting legislation that come and try and preempt us in some of these areas in an agreement to work together that now try and preempt what we were trying to do to work together, right? So, to Elliot's point, I don't believe statewide policy in some of these areas is the best way to go about it, because I think we kind of miss some of these problems. We can, saying that you can only do a back and forth 2 times on red lines. What if you miss something that's really important, right? That's the problem. But should cities also be giving you new things, the 5th time? No, that probably shouldn't happen. So how do we have these conversations? But also,
so Nick, you characterize what I wanted, and you mischaracterized it, but with good intent. So I don't think there was an ill intent to how you were characterizing what I want. Yeah, we build homes, and I also have a healthcare company, and I'm involved in a variety of different economic interests. I was mayor. Believe it or not, I love cities. I love the league, what it is that you guys do. Here's what I know. Phoenix has been a can-do place. Man, anytime I went out to the business community as mayor and I said, I need help, it was amazing how people would get in line and help us get done what we needed to get done. Sometimes that was a bond election. Sometimes it was more money for police. It could have been any one of a number of things. Sometimes it was economic development. I think the legislature is the least of your problems. I don't think many other builders are going to tell you. I think you ought to do a private poll of them. There's a belief, and it is widespread. You guys are a disaster, and you can't manage anything. Now, I don't believe that's true. I believe there are things that are in the way of doing better. But part of what's in the way is not knowing and understanding you have a big problem. And part of the problem is the people who over the years who have been there for us, that helped us get things done, they're losing faith in your ability to govern, in your ability to make things work. And that's a problem. It's a big problem. I've only laid out a portion of what I've seen. And I know other developers, you wouldn't believe these sessions when we talk to people, how irate very high level, big company CEOs are with the cities today. My answer to you is, you may think you're listening, but you're not listening enough. And you need to spend more time on this. I think the legislature is not the answer either. But it may be the only answer if cities aren't really going to play a constructive role. Do I believe they want to? Maybe. Maybe they do. I haven't, personally, I haven't experienced that yet, but I don't need to. All right. I'm a little teeny tiny small customer in this pool. If I'm giving advice, here's what it is. Pay attention to this issue. It's much bigger than you think, and it's going to have much bigger consequences than just the city. Now, saying that, I'm going to come back to saying this. There are a lot of things you guys do that's really important. Fighting crime, fighting fires, making certain that our buildings don't collapse on one another, building roads and parks. The cities play one of the most important roles because they build a sense of community. I know you guys do a lot of good things. I know sometimes you guys take beatings that you shouldn't have to take. I know sometimes people are harder on you, and maybe I have been during the show. And as I said, there isn't anything here that I have a complaint on that I couldn't have leveled that same complaint probably against myself during the period of time that I was there. But I want to end by saying thank you to you and the people that you serve, because I do think that they play an important role.
Thank you, Paul. if I can just have a close as well, I mean, all I'll say is, I think, I've never stood up in front of a committee hearing at the legislature and said cities do everything right. We do SWOT analyses all the time, just like major corporations do. What are our areas of opportunity, right? And so we will continue to do those. What are our areas of opportunity? What are our threats? We will look at that. But what I can say is we have built tremendous communities, as you have pointed out, and this is with the help of the developers. This is with the help of the business community. This is with the help of our residents. We've built tremendous communities over the last 5 decades, communities that people from across the country and across the globe want to come to. And I think that says something. I think that says that we're doing a lot right. And the things that we're not doing right, we will continue to try to get better.
Nick, thank you. I first, again, or last, I guess I will say, thanks for writing the letter. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and to talk about your position and the city's position. And Godspeed. I hope it works out well.
All right, Paul. Thank you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.